The Cuban Missile Crisis made up 13 of the most dangerous days in American history. In the heart of the Cold War, the United States stood toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union, each superpower pointing enough nuclear weapons at the other to destroy the world. Fear of nuclear war ran high, and world leaders prepared for the worst. The decision of nuclear war did not only belong to leaders in Washington and Moscow, but also rested with a Soviet submarine fleet commander named Vasily Arkhipov, who had the authority and the opportunity to launch a nuclear weapon on a United States Navy vessel. When the time came that Arkhipov had the right to launch his weapon, he took responsibility and resisted pressure from his crew to fire on the Americans, which ultimately prevented nuclear war. The Cold War began with the Yalta Conference, a meeting at the end of World War II between the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union to decide the fate of post-war Europe. During the meeting, tensions grew between the United States and the Soviets. Each had different points of view on the future. After that, tension continued to mount, and the world began to fear that two major superpower nations would soon be at war. Both countries began stockpiling weapons, which could potentially destroy the world if ever put into use. In January of 1959, the revolutionary named Fidel Castro took control of the government in Cuba. Within 2 years, he announced that Cuba was a communist state and established ties with the Soviet Union. Cuba was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and having Soviet allies so close placed the United States in a frightening situation. It also threatened to infringe upon the Monroe Doctrine, a foreign affairs policy established by President James Monroe. The doctrine warned foreign powers in the Eastern Hemisphere against interfering with the American continents. Since the doctrine was issued in 1823, the United States had considered itself the protector of the other nations in the Western Hemisphere, and felt a responsibility to shield them from foreign powers, especially communist ones. In the fall of 1962, 4 submarines were sent out from the Soviet Union. They were headed to Cuba as a part of Soviet military operations on the island nation, but these weren't just regular submarines. Each sub was carrying a nuclear torpedo with the same amount of power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. For the first time, the submarine commanders had the authority to fire the nuclear weapons without orders from Moscow. Along with the torpedo, the commanders also carried the responsibility to use the weapon only when necessary, because if used, it would plunge the world into nuclear destruction. The nervous breakdown of any one of these ordinary men could cause them to be responsible for nuclear war. Meanwhile, American U-2 spy planes flying over Cuba discovered a Soviet nuclear missile base on the island. The base was likely built in response to missiles which the United States had positioned in Turkey, pointed at the Soviet Union. If either nation chose to launch their missiles, the other nation would immediately launch their own in retaliation, and both nations would be simultaneously destroyed. On October 22nd, President John F. Kennedy addressed the nation on television and informed them of the presence of the missiles. He also declared that the United States would be putting Cuba under naval quarantine until the Soviets agreed to remove their nuclear missiles. No further missiles were to be allowed past the quarantine line, and the missiles already present were not to be fired.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
Along with the announcement of the quarantine came the alert order signed by Kennedy setting DEFCON 3, which activated all National Guard and Reserve units. The submarine commanders knew none of this, however. All they knew was that they were given commands to halt their progress and wait in the steamy Sargasso Sea for further direction. The conditions during that week they were waiting were miserable. They spent their days sweating, trying to hide from the U.S. military, and listening to Miami radio, the only information source they had from the outside world, which speculated over whether or not President Kennedy would order an attack on the missile base. The submariners were unsure if they were at war or not, and therefore had no idea what their current responsibilities were. The submarines Arkhipov and his men were in had to come to the surface regularly to recharge their batteries, which greatly raised their risk of being detected. While recharging after a week of being stationary in the Sargasso, B-59 was spotted by United States spotter planes searching for Soviet vessels trying to smuggle weapons to Cuba. B-59 had to perform an emergency dive deep into the ocean with only enough battery to remain submerged for 6 hours. October 27th was a day of extremely high tensions between the two countries. That day, U-2 spy plane pilot Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by Soviet surface-to-air missiles and killed. The United States had reached DEFCON 2 several days earlier, the highest alert level ever reached in America's history. Nuclear weapons were prepared to be fired within 15 minutes of notice. The president's brother, Robert Kennedy, said that he felt the nation was on the edge of a precipice with no way off. The U.S. Navy continued to hunt B-59. President Kennedy had already declared that protocol for this situation was not to attack the submarine, but to drive it to the surface instead. 12 naval destroyers began a barrage of depth charges directed at B-59, signals for them to come up to the surface. This continued for 5 hours. The charges sounded loudly against the hull of the sub and managed to scare the submariners and drive them crazy. One member of the crew said, "It felt like you were sitting in a metal barrel, which somebody is constantly blasting with a sledgehammer." Sub-Captain Valentin Savitsky did not understand that the depth charges were a signal to come up to the surface, and was unsure whether or not he was under attack. If he was, he had the right to defend his sub as well as the responsibility to fire on the Americans, because it would mean they were at war. If not, firing on the Americans would be considered an act of aggression, and would start the nuclear war that would destroy the world. It was a difficult decision that had to be made quickly. The submarine could not stay below the surface any longer. Men were starting to pass out from the dangerous levels of carbon dioxide. Savitsky, frustrated, exhausted, and unable to contact Moscow, had had enough. He ordered that the nuclear torpedo be prepared to fire, shouting, "Maybe the war has already started up there, while we are doing somersaults here. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." Under the circumstances, he had the authority to order the weapon to be deployed, but he also needed the agreement of the sub's political officer in order to launch the weapon. Together, their responsibility was to fire the weapon only when it became necessary. Each man held one half of a key which was used to deploy the torpedo. Perhaps not realizing that they might be responsible for a war that could destroy the world, and giving in to the fear and pressure of the moment, they agreed to use their right to attack the United States, and each gave their half of the key. However, on B-59, the commander of the fleet, Vasily Arkhipov, also held veto power. They could not fire the torpedo without his consent. He was responsible to check the power of the other two men. The decision of whether or not the U.S. and the Soviet Union would engage in nuclear war had come down to one man. Arkhipov was known for being a calm, controlled, and cool-headed person. He had witnessed the tragedy aboard the submarine K-19, in which another sub armed with nuclear capabilities had a nuclear reactor fail 1 year earlier, leaving 8 men dead. He had seen firsthand what nuclear weapons could do, and understood that along with the right to use nuclear weapons, he and the other officers had the responsibility to protect people from a similar fate. Although the other two senior officers each gave their half of the key, Arkhipov refused to give permission to launch the torpedo. The submariners were not certain that they were in a war, and to launch the torpedo would be a misuse of the right and authority they had been given. After Arkhipov adamantly vetoed firing the nuclear torpedo, B-59 surfaced and was turned around and sent back to Russia by the United States Navy. The U.S. naval officers had no idea that the sub was carrying nuclear weapons. A fatal confrontation had been narrowly avoided. That same evening, a deal was reached between the United States and the Soviet Union. President Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev were both very afraid of the possibility of nuclear war. Khrushchev had demanded that if the Soviets removed their missiles in Cuba, the United States would have to remove the missiles they had positioned in Turkey. That night, it was agreed that the Soviets would remove their missiles if the United States would publicly promise not to invade Cuba. They also secretly agreed that eventually the missiles in Turkey would be taken away. The next day, Radio Moscow announced the deal between the two nations, and the crisis was over. When the submariners of B-59 returned home, they were treated poorly. Rather than being congratulated for avoiding nuclear war, they were disgraced and told it would have been better had they gone down with their ship. Arkhipov later died of kidney cancer, a result of the K-19 disaster. Although he died feeling that those who ridiculed him didn't understand what he and his crewmates had endured on that B-59 voyage, many today thank him and rightly consider him to be a hero who saved the world. Had Arkhipov not stood up to Savitsky, the nuclear torpedo would have been fired, the United States would have retaliated, and much of the world likely would have been wiped out in the ensuing nuclear destruction. Although he had the right to use a nuclear weapon in an extremely tense moment, Vasily Arkhipov remained level-headed and responsibly chose to wait until he knew all of the facts before launching the world into nuclear war, and his brave actions saved the world from a nuclear apocalypse.